Hi there. Visiting ancestors, that is, visiting the places where your ancestors used to live, is a great thing to do, and often something that you can combine with a holiday, especially if your ancestors lived somewhere beautiful or where there are plenty of attractions to visit as well. And let's face it, in the UK, that's probably most places. Whether you're visiting a small village or a large town or a city. However, trying to find the house or street your ancestors lived in can be frustrating. The house may not exist anymore, or the street may have been demolished to make way for a dual carriageway. But even if this is so, there is still plenty you can do to get a feel for where your ancestors lived and worked. I've gone on ancestor hunts myself a couple of times, and the last one I did was a few weeks ago when I went to North Yorkshire, where two branches of my father's family lived. In doing so, I've come across some of the downsides of trying to find ancestors, but also some of the real advantages and emotional upsides of visiting places that your ancestors knew as home. So in this video, I'm going to advise you first of all on how to plan your visit and some of the research you'll want to do first. And then throughout the video, I will show you some of the videos that I've put together from my own visits to Yorkshire, as well as a previous visit as well, illustrating both the fulfilling side and some of the frustrations and how to deal with those. So let's talk about planning. First of all, you need to decide which ancestors you're visiting and whether you will be able to visit the house or the street or even just the village where they lived. If you're visiting 19th century ancestors, then much of your research will be on the census, where you will usually find street names and usually house numbers as well. In the case of my recent visit, no house numbers to go by, but here you can see the types of houses they would have lived in. So first of all, when I was in Yorkshire, I visited the town of Moulton in North Yorkshire, where my 3 times great-grandfather George Stamper lived, and where my great-great-grandmother Mary Jane Stamper was born. Now, I don't know which house they lived in. It might have been further down. George Stamper was a butcher. And one of the things I actually found out as I was just leaving Moulton was the corner right at the end of that street is called Butcher's Corner. So they may have lived on that corner much further down. But this is a very interesting street anyway. It's called Old Moorgate. And of course, with such a name, it used to be one of the old gates into the town. And this house on the left with the green door is actually a Grade 2 listed building. So they're rather nice old little houses, actually. And if you look at the history of Old Moorgate, I know that some of the houses on it were built using stone from an old priory that used to be nearby. And just on the right of this picture, you can see the spire of the nearby church of St Leonard's, which is where many of my Stamper ancestors were baptised, married and buried. Just a note about house numbers. If you do have a house number, do be careful with them. They can change over time, especially if the street was still being extended at the time that your ancestors lived there. And you can often find out if this is so by searching for town or village histories on the internet. A couple of years ago, I did some research for somebody who owned a cafe that used to be a 19th century pub. And when I looked at the history of the area, this was in Leamington Spa, I discovered that it was built at a time when Leamington was rapidly growing and the street that the pub was on, that road kept extending sort of for several decades, and the actual number of the pub changed about 3 times. So just something to watch out for there. Now, another place to plan to visit is the church where your ancestors were baptised, married and buried. The vast majority of these churches will still be in existence. So even if you can't find the house they lived in, you'll still be able to experience the church where they would probably have visited every Sunday and where they were baptised, married, had all their children baptised. In fact, very often you'll be able to find the very font that an ancestor was baptised in, just as I did here at the church in Moulton. And here is St Leonard's Church. Now, when I arrived here, there'd just been a service, and I discovered that it was a Catholic service. So I was very surprised to discover that it is actually now a Catholic church. And I went into the office and I inquired about this, and they confirmed, yes, it was switched from an Anglican church to a Catholic church some time ago, very unusually. Also, I found that the church itself was locked, but when I explained that I was visiting because my ancestors had been here, they very kindly allowed me into the church for a while. So I've just come to St Leonard's Church in Moulton, just near to where my ancestors, the Stamper family, used to live. And this is the church where many of them were baptised and married. It's a lovely old church. Just have a look. Unusually, some time ago, it turned it's now a Catholic church. But at the time my ancestors were here, it was Church of England. But over here, this is the old font. So this is where my great-grandmother, Mary Jane Stamper, her father, George Stamper, and many other Stampers would have been baptised. Isn't that lovely? So, yeah, I mean, this has been sort of tucked away behind some stored chairs and screens here. I don't know if they use it now, but it's really nice. There's something very special about finding that the old font in a church still exists, and you can envisage your infant ancestors as they were baptised here. It's rather a nice thing to find. And it's obviously it's kind of been rearranged a bit, this church, for I don't know whether it had been rearranged for the service that was on this morning, but you can see what a lovely church it is, and that lovely wooden arched ceiling is quite something. Another benefit of visiting churches is that you can search the graveyard for ancestors' graves. If they were wealthy, they may even have been buried or have memorials inside the church. However, you won't always be able to find the gravestone of an ancestor, even if you know they were buried there. Some gravestones have been moved to make more space, and also very often the older gravestones can be very difficult or impossible to read because they faded over time or have been covered in moss or lichen. But make sure that you're ready for the British weather. This one was when I visited my 4 times great-grandfather a couple of years ago. It's a wet day in Staffordshire. I've been on holiday for a few days in Derbyshire, and I thought I'd come back via my ancestral village of Alton, where some of my ancestors used to live in the late 18th and early 19th century. And this is the grave of my 4 times great-grandfather, Samuel Bott. Now, the wording on there is very faded now, but I do have it written down somewhere, and I might share it with you. But it's just a lovely thing to find where your ancestors lived and find their gravestones. It's actually incredibly moving. So it's a bit wet, but it's a lovely thing to do. Alton is such a lovely village. So yeah, it's worth taking the time to visit your ancestors. Hi, Samuel. Inside the church, look out for memorials, lists of clergymen, and also some churches produce little parish histories that you can buy for a small donation, which can give you some insight into the lives of the people that lived there. So make sure you've researched all the churches where your ancestor or ancestors were baptised, married and buried, and check exactly where they are using Google Maps before you make your visit. Another thing I would strongly suggest that you do before you visit is to check any old maps you can find for the period your ancestors were living there. You can sometimes find these on the internet, especially towns or cities, and you can use these to check against modern maps to find out if the street still exists. And you can use Google Street View to see whether the old houses are still there or whether they've been replaced. During the Victorian period, most towns and cities underwent rapid change and growth. So what is there now may be completely different to how your ancestors experienced it. If you're visiting places where your ancestors lived before the census record began, then finding the exact place is going to be a lot more difficult. You're not usually going to find the exact address or street. However, there are some things you can do to try and find out as much as possible. So, for example, wills. Property-owning ancestors may mention a house or farm names and locations in a will. Tax records can sometimes give an indication of the name of a house or farm. Newspapers are a really interesting and can be a useful place to look. In fact, I discovered this very recently when I was researching some of my ancestors on Find My Past and their collection of newspapers. And from this, I discovered that my ancestor Thomas Whiting had once owned a bookshop in Scarborough. And this is really exciting for me because I'm a writer, and I also have another channel on YouTube which is all about books, as I'm a big reader as well. So I was very excited to find in my family somebody who was related to books as well. So I also visited this particular street mentioned when I visited North Yorkshire. Also, occasionally in the parish registers, you might be lucky and find an exact place where your ancestors lived, maybe a street name. Particularly that happens sometimes in the bigger cities. Now, with regards to my Scarborough ancestor who owned the bookshop, I discovered that he sold this bookshop in 1821, and it was in the street called Newborough Street, which is now just called Newborough in Scarborough. And of course, unfortunately, there was no indication of the actual building, except he says it's in the best part of Newborough. Now, this was, and very much is, quite a busy shopping street in Scarborough. So in this case, obviously the shop fronts have changed considerably. But if you are visiting a street like this, then you need to look up and see the original architecture where it still survives, as I did in the following video. So this is the street called Newborough in Scarborough. It's just known by Newborough now, but when my 4 times great-grandfather Thomas Whiting had his bookshop here, it was called Newborough Street. Now, it's very interesting. I mean, it's obviously now quite a busy shopping street, and it probably was then as well. But when we visit shopping streets, we tend to be just looking at the modern day shop fronts. But when you're looking for where ancestors may have once lived or worked, it's really important to look up, because there's quite a few on this street. There's still quite a few old and original buildings, as you can see here. And with these just couple of little videos I made here, you can see again some of the styles of the buildings above the shop fronts here, which some of them are just rather lovely. And although, again, I couldn't find the exact building where my ancestor had his bookshop, it's nice to imagine which one of these buildings he might have been in. And also, don't forget to research some of the historic buildings that would have been usual sites for your ancestors: castles, the manor house, pubs, etc. Think about your ancestors' occupations. So, for example, if they were a gardener or a servant, they may well have worked for the local manor house, and some of these may now be open to the public. Agricultural labourers would have worked in nearby fields and farms. The men of the household would also no doubt have visited the local pub, so check out old pubs in the area, and this would be a good place for you to stop for lunch or your evening meal. So this has just been a brief guide to choosing to visit the places where your ancestors used to live and work, but I hope you found it a little bit helpful. It certainly can be a very rewarding and quite emotional experience sometimes, but it also can be sometimes a little bit frustrating. But in my experience, visiting the areas and the streets and the places your ancestors knew well it's a very kind of warm feeling. You feel kind of more in touch with the people that up until now have just been names on a family tree chart. And I often find that when I visit these places where my ancestors have lived, these areas very much feel like home to me as well. So if you have done that in the past, do let me know what kind of experience it has been for you, and also maybe you can add to my bits of advice here as well from your own experiences. So that's it for now. I do hope you've enjoyed this little video, and that any holidays you go on and where you visit your ancestors will be a great experience and a very rewarding one. Don't forget to like and subscribe. And also, if you need any help with researching your ancestors in the UK, do have a look at my website and contact me for the details of my ancestry tracing service. So good luck with all your searches and visits, and hopefully I will see you again soon. Bye for now.